The countdown is coming. We are, oh, I lost track. Monday is the last full day on the Kickstarter for those of you watching this in real time. And real time, we are so excited because we've got some special goodies coming up over the weekend, which you can watch on my channels and Kiltz's channels to find out about. But we recognize that maybe we haven't convinced enough of you yet. Actually, we need some more gold. How utterly cool this project is that we're working on, and studying the internets, we recognize that we have not been using our prime selling point, which is we're writing a fairy story. So we tonight we want to sort of dig down deep into the mythology of what fairy stories are, why we're doing fairy stories, where we are going with fairy stories, why we call what we're doing a fairy story. And yes, there will be a bit of Tolkien, and yes, there will be a bit of Pratchett, and we're going to take a sample story that maybe some of you are paying attention to right now because it's out there in the interwebs being talked about. We promise to take you places you didn't expect. Welcome to the Mosaic Arc. So, are we going to tell them what we're actually doing? I mean, I think probably we're too modest.
Yeah. I don't know. Do we start bragging without holding back? Is that what we need to do?
Possibly. I'm thinking. I mean, so I was one. It was funny because I was thinking, have we really not told them this yet? We're writing a fairy story, guys, and so I looked back through. We've been, telling you guys about the Kickstarter for a month now because we started with the letters that Edmund Spencer wrote to promote his story, and we've done some on the backstory, the behind the scenes that you can get from our website. I mean, seriously, guys, we know absolutely everybody who watches the Mosaic Arc is thirsty for knowledge, and we are here to bring it to you. We've put up lots and lots of reading lists, study guides, links to things that Professor Fulton Brown, me, has been doing for decades in thinking about storytelling and exegesis and imagery and Christian mythology and stuff. This, when we say we're in an arc, we're floating on an ocean. And just wanting to share all of that with you all and give you some sense of the tradition that we should all be drinking from, like from a fire hose. It's interesting. I mean, I have this. I mean, if you've been watching me on Twitter the past week or so, I've been trying to get people's attention with yes, Christianity is true and it's the only truth. And if any truth that's out there that, seems to resonate with Christianity is because Christ is the truth. I mean, really, guys, we mean it. We really, really, really mean it. But these are truths that are also come folded in stories and symbolism and centuries and centuries and centuries of participation in liturgy and prayer and art. And I was having a meditation. We had a wonderful procession. It was indoors because it was raining, for the Sunday feast of Corpus Christi. Corpus Christi in the Latin church is on Thursday after Trinity Sunday, but because people's church going now is tends to be more weekly, we have these extraordinary observances. And on Sunday at St. John Cantius, we had the feast, the procession for Corpus Christi, and we did it indoors because we wouldn't get rained on if we go outside. And I was it was a very crowded church, and I was sitting in a line, so I couldn't actually see the altar from where I was sitting. I was like 3 rows down, but I was behind a pillar, and on the pillar was the life-size crucifix, very realistic life-size crucifix that we have in St. John Cantius. And I was thinking about that representation as this historical moment, right? When we're in the liturgy, we're always remembering the full sort of layers of symbolism that go into the sacrifice, both the remembrance of the Holy Thursday, the reenactment of the crucifixion, and the promise of life that we are participating in communion. And I was thinking, and let's see if I can give you the full force of this thought that struck me. It's like, we've been doing this for almost 2,000 years. Now I'm going to cry. And you could say, okay, we're just repeating it over and over and over again for 2,000 years. 2,000 years. What an incredible rupture into time that it has reverberated for 2,000 years. That's quite an event.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, it defines our time, doesn't it? As we've said before, time is before Christ in Anno Domini, year of our Lord, and that repetition, that liturgical repetition, is the living expression of that. I mean, we have been literally living in year of our Lord times 2,000. It's magnificent.
2023, and it doesn't matter whether the calendar was only calculated a certain amount of time, and say that there was, I think you shared this, maybe I saw it in Telegram, Neil deGrasse Tyson, however you say his name, saying why he says AD, because the calendar is actually Christian, and he's saying it's the Gregorian calendar was calculated in the 16th century, and it's, the most accurate calendar we have. But the point being, the numbering is from the Incarnation. And, there are all of these these are not just symbols, they're realities of our historical experience. And there are anchors for what it means to be alive, who we are, not just as Christians, right, but as human beings. And that event, saying the creator of everything, right, just get your mind around everything, entered into his creature in a particular moment in time. And you say, well, why then? It's like, well, because when he did it, it was when he did it. Because if it's going to be an entry into time, it's going to affect time. It's going to, and so I had this meditation a while ago saying it's like the cross is like this giant pin that just shoots into the world, into reality, into time. And it's like you had this chaotic, waving, unformed, chaos does not exist before creation. It's part of the creation, or is it? But the Incarnation pins time and therefore creates time, and likewise God creates everything. That's just true. And so to claim that, we have different truths or we have different realities, or something, no, we don't. There's reality, and it's the creature of God. There you go. So I've been trying to say this on Twitter in ways that get people's attention so that they will give us gold for our Kickstarter to tell our fairy story, which is in fact this story because there's only one. But saying that in modernity, we've lost so much of a sense of, you say that enchantment, that enstoryment, the enchantment is the insongment, right? The chanting, the insongment. We've lost so much of our insongment that people think there can be, multiple realities. Oh yes, your truth, my truth. And so, no, we are trying to show you this truth through a fairy story, and those fairy stories are therefore what's most true. And I get that this blows people's minds.
Oh, you triggered a memory. You know, I heard a lot a lot of cradle Catholics, Orthodox included, that have been repeating this phrase. Oh, you know, everyone has their own truth. In the last few years, it always struck me as a very odd thing that even you know, this kind of treating time as a subjective experience instead of an objective reality has become part of Catholic thinking. And I don't think that I mean, the particular people that were saying this at the time really understand how profound it is that they've rejected the concept of an objective truth, but truth as a person. This, you know, this kind of thing is happening here more and more, and I'm wondering whether or not it's not because we're becoming more fused to the Asiatic mentality, which of course doesn't have the BC AD distinction as much as the Mediterranean West. But you know, the more we're getting pulled away from that pin, that crucifix, the more you know, unstable everyone is becoming. So you know, you talk about enchanted, but the cultures which held onto the crucifix had this kind of magical quality about them that has started to run away. They're, you know,
well,
modernity bleaches people really quickly.
Okay, so we can go two different directions. Yes, we talked to them. That I've also been playing with that on the Twitter. It's like the whiteness. It's like white supremacy and the white. You know, it's like it's the bleaching out of all culture, as we've talked about. But so there's on the one side that bleaching out of all culture, so that no stories have reality. And then I think we've trying to point people here to this concept that you're describing of maybe not the Orient. It's funny that we can't say Oriental is a positive, because Oriens is actually the rising sun, right? It's the light. It's the Orient is where the light comes from. The Occident, that's the darkness, right? We live in the Occident. Well, you don't.
I'm Oriental,
you're Oriental, baby. You're out there with the rising sun over the Great Pacific, right? That you guys out there in the Orient have that dream world too, right? That dream time that is unanchored in, I mean, history or linearity. We often say that, and saying, well, story is the way we have meaning, and you know, we look in patterns and we try to say this means that because of the way these analogies play out. But if there's no anchor story, the analogies are like madness, right? It's like anything could connect to anything else, and it means nothing. It's a psychedelic horror.
Yes, definitely. Anything can mean anything. There's no. I mean, it's a kind of mythological alphabet. People are not using the same lettering, and so they're saying whatever they want, and this can mean whatever we want it to mean. It destroys storytelling, because people don't have any concept of truth when they're telling the story. So I mean, it's been quite it's a very strange thing, you know, to be an Oriental. I don't know why you guys are allergic to this term. I mean, I'm quite comfortable with it. We are Oriental.
The Oriental Institute in Chicago changed its name, so it's not the Oriental Institute anymore.
That's quite racist. I mean, like, why? Our entire church is called Oriental Orthodox Churches, so I don't know why they have a problem with that. Maybe we don't have a problem with it. We don't have a problem with being Oriental.
Well, I could go down the rabbit hole and explain this, but let's not.
Okay, we won't go there. And also, I'm just shit stirring. I know, like, everyone has their own like issues with things over in your in
In the dark,
the
in the dark side. We
yeah,
over here in the Occident,
yeah,
where the sun
yes,
sets and the light goes out.
yeah. um yeah, this very strange kind of idea that we have. I mean, sorry, my brain's going in two directions with this. We're talking about the ability for people to communicate truth in their art and truth in their stories, their storytelling. This kind of idea of having a shared understanding of what truth is in order to even be able to give somebody a story. Uh, Australians take for granted that the tales that they've inherited from the old world are anchored in Christian time. They really do take it for granted, because at the moment the national argument is to decolonize, and embrace the indigenous, or embrace this, or whatever, embrace the multicultural, and not realizing that essentially what that means is to embrace non-time as we know it.
Well,
This
just
challenges
non-time. It's not
us.
even as we know it. It's saying,
Yeah.
I think what I'm realizing as we're talking right now is unless you have something like you think of as linear time, there is no such thing as speech.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Uh,
Yeah, the tenses are disappeared.
and there's no, I mean, there is no such thing as stories, because stories are meaningful only insofar as you tell them in time. It's like a song. Music
Mm-hmm.
happens in time. It may
Yes.
recur back and point back to things that re-reference things, so that meaning arises out of that sense of mutual reference. But if
Mm-hmm.
everything references to everything else, there is no meaning. It's just like nothing references to anything,
Yes.
there's no meaning. But if everything references to everything, and there's, I mean, we've been talking a little bit about this, and like the way the kids these days um don't have, I mean, they have, I've been witness to this in younger people that I know. They have a very interesting sense of humor, because things are just funny to them. And when they show me stuff and I'm like, I don't even, I mean, there's no referent, and they're like, oh no, it's not really a referent, or maybe there is a referent. It's like nothing means anything if the references don't tie together and don't have any sort
Mm-hmm.
of um like, not everything can mean everything else. And if it does, it really is chaos. I don't see how our brains
Mm.
can function if we don't believe in stories.
They
They
can't.
can't.
They can't. Um, uh, I was reading Chesterton, and he talked about that kind of mythological chaos, that it bred a kind of mystical schizophrenia, because you get in a kind of hysterical mysticism where
Right.
you've got no dogma to anchor it. And it was interesting what he was saying, very relevant to what we're doing in the crafting of our fairy tale, that people that are constantly trying to find connections between things that don't have a dogmatic anchor end up essentially insane, because you find connections with no truth.
Right.
And then it's a never-ending experience of connecting things, which there's no end to it, because there's no prototype, there's no pattern that you're working with. So it kind of, as he's explaining his perspective on the Oriental mysticism that's constantly challenging the church and Western culture, is that there's this kind of amorphous mystical madness which is constantly flooding from the East, and it's story without purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So just this kind of frenzied attempt at fairy tale, but there's no beginning, middle, and end, because they're not connecting it to anything. So yeah, it was interesting how that has influenced the culture here. Makes sense to me, because we have a really difficult moment as a culture in Australia to define ourselves as Oriental or Occidental. We're not really sure. We have an identity crisis. And even the Mediterranean peoples that have come here are starting to become influenced by this concept of a subjective time, subjective truth, subjective storytelling, that anything can be anything and you have to, accept everybody's truth.
Well, so it's like Orient and Occident don't mean anything whatsoever if there's no anchor.
Yep.
You're literally spinning in circles, and there's not even a center and a periphery. There is. It's so interesting. It's like, so I just thought of 8 things. One, there's a sort of insight in cognitive psychology that came out in the 80s or so, that all of our language is metaphorical. So it's Lakoff and Johnson's book, Metaphors We Live By, which they're showing things that all of our language is already metaphorical. There's no such thing as a literal, because we're already embedding things in, for example, language as container. We put ideas into words, for example, into words is a metaphor of container. But they also realize that all of our metaphors are embodied, because we have 2 primary experiences of being containers ourselves. We put stuff into ourselves, things come out of ourselves. Babies, if you're a woman. And we move in space, right? And we have a front and a back, right? So we move forward and backward and sideways, but those are meaningful to us because we have front and back, right? And that without these anchors of being volumes that move in space, nothing would mean anything. Everything that we talk about has both of these container metaphors and these movement metaphors. This is the most enlightening conversation we've had for me. Like, wow. So you can't think, not just you need stories for, to model your consciousness or something like that William James might say in Elements of Psychology, but that we premise meaning on the basis of stories that can only have meaning if you can anchor them in our experience of time and place. History. Guess what, people? It's history. Yeah. So, stories are very important then, eh?
Yeah.
I think we've established that. I thought, no, it's like, I'll start with my pictures. I thought we were just going to be looking at manuscripts and going, woo, cool. As Indiana Jones here is with the bad guy from Last Crusade. Sorry, spoiler alert. But, the way everybody loves stories, right? And particularly, we know this from the movies. I mean, movies are magnificent storytelling in so many ways, because the linearity and you've got sound, you've got movement of images, and you've got sort of therefore this dynamic narration, so you can make linear stories out of them. But embedded in those stories is always the desire to discover story, and obviously the Indiana Jones movies are doing this. At least the early ones are doing this well. And the trope of, we have this book. Here we have it. We'll go to the book. We'll do the next picture. Go to the book. The book, right? Which has it's usually a fairy story, right? There's some kind of legend or, secret lore that is embedded in this media substrate, manuscript, that will then, give the characters purpose in their adventure. So stories give us purpose. They give us, quests and things like that. And everybody wants one. Definitely.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, you just reminded me. I watched Twilight not long ago. It was my
I've never seen that.
My guilty pleasure of watching the most ridiculously bad young adult romance with vampires. But they also had this scene where one of the main characters has to go to an Indian bookstore and get a book that has one of the ancient Indian legends in it in order to figure out that her boyfriend is indeed a vampire. So yes, the necessity to plug into myths and fairy tales from different periods to find the hidden truths of our world. It was a big theme in that story.
Well, so I mean, Twilight's a good one to choose. One, because I've never seen it, so you can tell me about it, and B, it works on the level. I do know it's probably about vampires, I think, and they sparkle. Is that right? And one's named Edward, possibly. That we take pleasure from being able to connect ourselves to tropes and so that the a good deal of storytelling is in that shock of recognition. Oh, it's that story, right? And sort of the mystery feels fun for a bit, but you do want to know which other stories it anchors to, and therefore gives meaning to the story that you're in at this moment. It's so interesting. We can't do this. We can say Western or Eastern storytelling. We in the West, in the Occident, in the Christian, are constantly looking for the place that we find ourselves in these stories, right? Here's the manuscript that Indiana Dr. Jones is looking at. I mean, what's hilarious is in the movie they're talking about it being the friar's manuscript, and it's telling about the guy from the crusade who, lived to a very old age and stuff. The prop makers for this manuscript were actually dedicated enough to their craft that even though the manuscript is only there for like a second, and you can play, until you were able to do things like take screenshots off of YouTube, you weren't able to see it. The text has nothing to do with any of that. It's about Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot. And I don't know whether what they copied it off of to do the marginal illuminations and stuff, but it looks like manuscript, right? So it says, here we are in this old story that has details that will give us clues to who we are in our present story. It's like everybody loves this.
Yes. Yeah, they do. Well, Twilight. Okay, so I can't believe I'm streaming about Twilight.
You brought it up. I'm playing with it.
I know.
You knew that. I was going to go talk about Johnny Depp and Hunter Thompson. I mean, come on.
Oh, that's a good. I know that's good. We go there. All right. So, human girl travels to Seattle, small town around Seattle. It's really dark and cold, and it rains all the time. Basically, meets a guy. Figures out he's a vampire because of the Indian fairy story book that she finds at the bookshop. But that particular story does the same thing in quite a few moments where the writer has clearly deliberately inserted references, cultural references that people can look at and think, oh, this is what we're looking at. So in the case of Twilight, it's Romeo and Juliet. So there's a scene where she's doing homework for her English class, and she's reading iambic pentameter, which was also really nice. I thought, oh great, they put some iambic here in this vampire film, but it instantly connects this romance to Shakespeare's. They've done it in a few of the other Twilight books as well. So they're referring to the Merchant of Venice. What are the other ones? Quite a few Shakespeare ones are referenced in there as well. So it connects the present with the past. Suddenly you have time, which, I mean, now that we're talking about it and now that I'm thinking about it, can only work if the stories are joined, if they're knit together somehow in a logical way. And so if for example we do the modern approach where anything can mean anything, and this term can mean this now because we've just redefined it, well, you can't knit those two things together, because in one case you have a vampire romance connected to Shakespearean Romeo and Juliet, but if these things can mean whatever you want them to mean, the references disappear.
Right.
It's obliterated. And what that does to the mind, it's an interesting thing to think about. Like, start to obliterate the references of your fairy stories, change the meaning. Suddenly, the mind has nothing to attach to.
Well, yes, and we can say that this is, people are locally upset about, they're destroying the references to this story or that story, but saying, yes, you will go insane if you cannot place yourself in reference to the other stories. And if there is no, I mean, as we've been saying, if there's nothing to anchor you one to the other in the tropes, you cannot think.
Yep. That's Australia. It is, though.
Right.
It is. We have purposefully disconnected ourselves from the stories of the old world that brought us here in the first place. And we're deliberately and purposefully stopping people from looking at those stories because of this thing called diversity and multiculturalism. And our stories as a nation have to be linked to the origin, the origin myths of the civilization that started this place. But because of this, I mean, I don't know, would you call it an agenda? It's sort of the anti-fairy agenda.
The anti-fairy agenda.
The anti-fairy agenda that says that it's redundant to look at the origin stories of your own culture. It's impolite. We have to abandon them. We have to look at other people's stories now without being able to knit them to our own. And so Australia has this, bizarre cultural schizophrenia that everybody's apologizing for being Western, but they don't know what Western means. We've just had this conversation about what it means to be Oriental and Occidental. They don't know what it means to be Western. They're not in the West. They're in the Orient, with no story links that would allow them to pick up something like Twilight and say, oh, okay, we're in Romeo and Juliet, or we're referencing The Merchant of Venice. What is that? Who wrote these stories? Where was he? The references are all being broken. It's like a tapestry that's being pulled apart thread by thread and then thrown all over the place. That's how I feel here.
But the thing is, it's not just
the conversation, the culture.
It's not just reference to the founding colonists or parent culture.
No
at all. And this is, of course, what Chesterton is trying to show in Everlasting Man, which I confess you're further along in reading than I am rereading, so you may have more of this in your head right now. But to say the Christian story is true and is the truth is to say all of these stories can be knit together. They do make sense, that there is an overarching pattern to all of it that will, result in, the contemplation of God, which is a beautiful thought. Whereas what you're saying, what's the anti-fairy agenda? It's chaos. It's madness. It's the inability to see anything true. It's ugly and chaotic and broken. Whereas the Christian, Christian story is, this is a meaningful existence that, if you pay attention to these patterns, will lift you up in contemplation and joy and praise of your Creator.
Yeah. Yep. That uplifting experience. This that's going to transform somebody to, as you've described it, to enter fairy, to become enchanted, is going to uplift you, which will transform somebody, and then it will transform a culture, and it's going to challenge the anti-fairy world, because it's not going to look the same. It's not going to look the same. People are not going to sound the same and think in the same way if they have made these connections and they've truthfully enchanted themselves, in truth, not in this chaotic, unanchored mysticism of different storytelling, where anything can be anything. Words mean, these word containers can mean a million different things at any one point. We're scrambling and arguing over the word containers instead of coming to an agreement over what they mean. People are taking things out all the time, pouring new things in. There's no consensus. So
well, it's so my next visual example was Hellboy. Which I haven't seen except for to figure out. So I heard a reference recently to the fact that they had, like in Indiana Jones, they have a manuscript, right? I'm like, ooh, cool. So I was looking it up, and even in Hellboy, which I think I need to watch, they have a manuscript, right? Which the designers, Heather Pollington worked on this with she has a collaborator. She said who it was. They take. I was looking at it. Looks like some famous Anglo-Saxon or pontificals and things like that to me. But that they reference the antiquity of story by way of having this manuscript that the Roddy Dow character is reading to the young Hellboy, I think. Even in hell. Structure of story. And what I understand about Hellboy, which I would like to, is like he is actually he's like covered in crosses and stuff like that. And the other scene that I saw, where he's wearing rosaries and everything, that he is actually a Christian character. That it's like, you guys, you're not going to get outside of the Christian story because it's the only one, because it's structuring this whole drama that we're living in, of being creatures in a world in which, interestingly, we're given free will to make choices. Therefore, our lives feel meaningful because we can make choices. And story is the thing. One of the big things everybody talks about this, like stories, fairy stories and stuff, can help train you in making choices because they give you models of bad choices. But it's, all stories are doing that. History does that. You read it for good and bad examples. So even in hell, well, Hellboy is actually positive, but you don't get out of this single story structure because it is the one that gives us meaning. The opposite, and I didn't think of this until we were talking, is something like, so I've been on, one day we're gonna have to do a full stream on all Johnny Depp movies because I'm watching all of them.
Yes.
The one he did about Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and it's not a pleasant movie to watch because like they just get trippier and trippier and trippier, and it's like, yeah, that's what it's like. It's like you're in the true psychedelic. Literally nothing, everything can. Things change from one moment to the next and they have zero logic. And the more your brain tries to make logic out of them, the harder it gets. And it's just lizard people and floods and who knows, right? Yeah. That what's interesting, this manuscript that they try to make for Hellboy, it's hellish in a way, right? Because it's like sort of blue and green and weird. It was hellish for me because I looked too close at the screenshot and realized it has no text. It's like gibberish. Compared to Indiana Jones, this one's actually gibberish.
The lorem ipsum.
It's not even lorem ipsum. It's like three words repeated over and over again and unseals, right? The beauty requires structure and logic and pattern, and stories give us that insofar as they satisfy that desire for connections.
Well, that's what we were saying before in terms of like Zoomer generation and the humor, the Zoomer humor. Zoomer humor, I described it during our Twitter crusade. It was ADHD and low dose hallucinogenics. I mean, it's like the generation that have lost connection with all of the stories that would pull them into the one story. They lack the manuscript understanding of their own culture. So they've just kind of inherited this fear and loathing in Las Vegas experience of Western civilization, where it's like, and I really understand that because I kind of started in there and got spat out the other end. But this no idea where to start with the attention, no idea, how to orientate. This is why Oriental is for me, it's such a beautiful word. An Oriental, in our understanding of Oriental Orthodox, I mean, we can say, yeah, we're Eastern, but also we're orientated. We know where to look. We have the cross, we have the crucifix, we're orientated in time. So, you've got disorientated generation which have no fixed point for their attention to start. So it's like a cultural ADHD plus a load of hallucinogenics. I mean, that's not just rhetoric, you know. They're vaping low dose hallucinogens in this kind of mode of thinking where there's no anchor. So it is very, very psychedelic. And then the references are all over the place, and you think, where are you? You know, you've got to kind of patiently understand that this is the psychology of tribal people that don't have a connection to a big foundational myth. Somehow that's how they think.
Yes, and I'm gonna keep derelativizing you. The foundational myth.
Yeah. The foundational myth.
You zooming around there in Dreamtime, and oriented. Medieval maps were literally oriented east is at the top, right? Because that's where paradise is. So the Orient is the east, is paradise. It's like the place in the earthly world where you are most focused. Jerusalem's at the center, and paradise is at the top. I'd say we've talked about this in sort of the tribal drums. What were you talking about the tribal drums recently? Were we putting it?
Oh, the radio. When you did your McLuhan.
Oh yeah. The tribal drums, right? And that without the structure of history and the incarnation, we are back in that terrifying world of the enemy's coming over the hill at any time. We have to be the tribe, I think, is the feeling. So the fairy stories are some way out of this.
Yes, the manuscript that we need to give us the clue.
So I've been thinking.
The realization.
Yes, so I've been thinking about fairy stories my whole life because all of us have. We grew up with them, right? And it's like I don't think I saw a lot of the Disney ones when I was growing up because we didn't have video yet. I'm that old. And they didn't necessarily show on television in repeat. I mean, it's interesting the things that I did see in repeat a lot, like The Wizard of Oz, because that was on every Thanksgiving, I think. But otherwise, it was actually a long time before I saw a lot of the famous Disney movies. So my deep fairy experience is, let me say this out loud and make sure. So right now what I'm showing is one of my drawings, but it's not mine. No, it is mine. I did do it, right? When I was, says 79, so I was 14. But it's copying my absolute favorite children's artist, Trina Shart Hyman. And we're going to talk about, we've been thinking about Snow White, so I have my copy of her Snow White, although this isn't my original one. I'll explain why in a second. I knew about her art because Cricket is a children's magazine, which I believe is still being published. But Cricket, its first issue was in 1973, and Trina Shart Hyman was the art director for Cricket. And Cricket was so called because it had little insect characters that were its sort of mascots. And she did all of the marginal creatures, right? She did Cricket, and there's Ladybug, and there was Caterpillar, and there's several others. And like they'd be there in the letter section, and they'd sometimes be commenting on different stories in the issue. And there was an old Cricket at the end. And she also did like pictures for some of the covers and some of the stories in it, and I adored her drawing style. If I were not me and had actually drawing skills as opposed to just like copying skills, I did draw this. I didn't trace it. If I had her actual imagination as an artist, that's what I really always wanted to do was draw like Trina Shart Hyman did. Anyway, I wanted that so much that one time I wrote to her, and I had kid privilege at that point, so she wrote back to me. Yeah, it was great. It was like my first true fangirling was writing to Trina Shard Hyman, and I drew a copy of one of her, I think they're old cricket, right? I drew one of the crickets, and I wrote to her, and she wrote back to me, and she said, "Oh, so thank you. It was a lovely, like, hand lettered card, and thank you so much and stuff." And she enclosed a little sketch of her daughter ice skating. I mean, it was truly just a sketch, right? It was like a little card, and she just like drafted and stuff like that. So I say this isn't my original copy of this. I had copies of her books, which, when did this one come out? Snow White came out in 74, right? So I would have had this before I went off to college. My mother, when I was in college, packed up a box and put my favorite books, my absolute favorite books, including that card with that sketch, in the box. Yeah. And it went missing in the mail. So I lost my sketch by her, and I've had to since then. I think I had a hardcover copy of this one, and I had to buy new copies of the books. So yeah. So this to me is what fairy stories should be illustrated like, and they are, well, they're absolutely magnificent. And these are photos from this book. I'm not showing all of the book, so you have to go buy it. Unfortunately, Hyman died about 10 years ago, I think, of cancer. So she died in her 60s, so young. We should still be getting pictures from her, but alas, we aren't. She did so, and you will also appreciate that the reason one of the many reasons we're using Fairy Queen as our model for Draco Alchemicus is she did an illustrated version of St. George and the Dragon, which is the book from the Fairy Queen, the first book from the Fairy Queen that we're practicing with, and that one won the Caldecott Medal, which is the great prize for children's book illustration. I love her work so much. It's so amazing and haunting and exquisite and beautiful, right? It's like she got everything that these fairy stories are trying to capture of the antiquity, the passion. They're not all for kids in the sense that if you like look in the marginalia of drawing, you're going, what is that? What's going on there? Oh my goodness. So she had a daughter, but she also partnered with a woman in her later years. So we see complicated stories here in the background, but nobody can match the way she draws hair, as far as I'm concerned. Hair, as Trina Shard Hyman draws, she nails it.
Yeah, she nailed the hair.
Which is very appropriate for a story about women's beauty. Yes. So what are fairy stories? Professor, who loved Trina Shard Hyman as she was growing up and has spent her entire life teaching Tolkien. Oh no, since 2005. Yeah. Oh, I'm so happy you asked.
I didn't even have to say anything.
I'm in monologue now. We're going there.
Let me trigger you again.
Wait,
hold on
no, trigger me,
What's
please.
A fairy story? What's a fairy story, RFB?
Oh, look, I have another book. I've got 3 books. Okay, so what is a fairy story? I will now lecture. People, because we don't have a big audience right now, so you guys are not going to get interrupted by super chats as I now pontificate or professorate or confess. I don't know. Anyway, so people often reference Tolkien because he wrote a very famous lecture on fairy stories, right? And in my other referent here, I have a copy of the annotated Brothers Grimm to tell you where we're going with this. It's
got gold on it. I see gold.
It's got gold, right? It's very gold, and it was translated, edited with notes by Maria Tater and translated by her. She is was in 2000 something when this book came out. 2004, it was new. She was, let's see, Dean for the Humanities and John L. Loeb Professor of Germanic Languages and Literatures at Harvard University, and lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is not why I bought it. I bought it because there's an introduction by A.S. Byatt. And if you know anything about modern sort of fantasy romance literature, you'll know Byatt won the Booker Prize for Possession back in the 80s. I don't think it's a first print paperback, but it's a British print paperback. So when she came here to give a lecture and read from her work, I got her to sign that copy. And of course she recognized it. And I felt really good because like, no. And the thing is, Byatt also writes fairy stories, right? So we've got a lot of like scholarly lineage in my lap at the moment. And I forgot where I was going. Oh, yes. So in Maria Tater's Dean of Humanities from Harvard introduction to the Grimm fairy tales, she quotes Tolkien. You didn't think I could bring it back, right? I can. I'm that good. Okay.
You're a boomerang.
I'm a boomerang. Although sometimes you have to throw me and wait a long time before I come back.
The circle the
I've
planet.
gone around. Here we are. Santa Claus has nothing on me when I get a lecture going. Okay, so what Tater says about Tolkien is telling, because this is the part of his argument that most people will know, right? And I think I'll read this bit, right? Because she gave a long quote. So she says, J.R. Tolkien recognized how powerfully the magic of a happy ending resonates with listeners and readers when he described the blissful relief that comes with the words, and they lived happily ever after. So it's a signature conclusion to a fairy story. Like, what are fairy stories about? Happily ever after, right? And he says, quote, the consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, of the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy tale. This joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist nor fugitive. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. With that ending comes a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to or indeed accompanied by tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art and having a peculiar quality. End quote. And then she says, fantasy, escape, recovery, and consolation. These were for Tolkien the defining features of fairy tales, and they tell us something about how the fairy tale promises restitution for loss, injury, grief, damage, harm. For every girl who loses her mother and is persecuted by her stepmother, there will be a king who boils that stepmother in a vat of oil filled with snakes, toads, and lizards. And so forth. So that fairy stories are consoling, and Tolkien talks about, you know, it's escapist because you're escaping from the prison of disenchantment, and recovery and fantasy, right? It's like, and most people, when they think of fairy stories and invoke Tolkien, are going to do that, right? They're enchantments and escape. Okay, so we'll go with that. Yeah, okay. Well, Terry Pratchett.
Oh,
no, wait, no. Boomerang.
Okay.
Come on, let me. Don't bring me my boomerang back. I want to hold that one out there.
Keep going.
Yeah. Okay. So, but I mean, do we all agree? All five of you are here. Where is everybody?
They're chasing a
They
boomerang.
are. They're trying to figure out what on earth she's talking about. I was like, I'm never going to get the popular audience I want if I'm relying on these boomerang throws. Am I? Guys, come on. It's not that hard. You can stay with me. And you can replay the video if you lost the space. Mel says, my copy of that Snow White arrived. The kids love it. It's magnificent. It's like, if you have not yet discovered Trina Schardheimen's fairy books, you are missing out on some of the great art of the modern period. There's that boomerang's still out there. Okay, so
I'm just gonna call. All right, it's upgraded to Zoomerang.
Zoomerang. It's a Zoomerang. Zoom. Okay, so we've established that scholars at Harvard recognize Tolkien as an authority on fairy stories. We got that right, and recognizing Tolkien on fairy stories, it's typically this idea that he gave of eucatastrophe, right? This happy ending, this sudden joyous turn, with the ideas of escape, recovery, and consolation. There's also some other stuff in the essay on whether fairy stories are primarily for children and the super stories and stuff like that. But we'll just go with this sort of one version of fairy stories is they console, right? Is that what Terry Pratchett says? Class, just say no, because this is the thing is, if once my students and my undergraduates get a wind of how I do this, they just sit there. It's like she's done what she's asked another of her twit questions, which we know the answer to is no, and we'll just wait for her to explain why, right? Okay, so what's funny about what I'm just entertaining myself by this point.
Oh no, it's entertaining. I'm just not going to say anything.
You're waiting for the boomerang. Okay, so one idea is that they make us feel good, right? But Pratchett, who is nothing if nothing but mischievous, right? Our sample for today from Pratchett is Witches Abroad, which is one of my absolute favorite of his books, which includes mirrors, right? So mirrors, there's a Snow White element here too. But the witches in this story are having to fight the stories, right? Because in this story, fairy stories are the thing that binds you into having certain outcomes. For example, for every girl who loses her mother and is persecuted by her stepmother, there will be a king who boils that stepmother in a vat of oil filled with snakes, toads, and lizards, right? That we have this one version of storytellers, fairy stories, is that they have the kinds of endings that feel satisfying, right? This is what Pratchett says about stories. And what's lovely, I'm giving you guys all of my references now. Pay attention. A.S. Byatt, J.R.R. Tolkien, Terry Pratchett. They've all actually been in conversation with each other for decades now about fairy stories. Pratchett quotes Tolkien. Byatt quotes Pratchett, quotes Tolkien. Pratchett plays off of Tolkien. Tater, talking about the Grimm fairy tales, talks about Tolkien, right? It's like one of the ways in which you know that you're in a fairy story is everybody's referencing everybody else. And within this sort of scholarly, literary, and Byatt's not a professor, she's a novelist, right? Crafting of the way stories work. We're trying to figure out, in fact, why we're so attached to them, I think. Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, Pratchett, whom Byatt quotes in the essay that she writes on fairy stories. I should go back to the manuscripts that have all those vines entwining everything, right? It's a really good image for the way this storytelling happens, right? Everything gets entangled up and entwined and everything else. And on the Discworld, people take things seriously, like stories, because stories are important. People think that stories are shaped by people. In fact, it's the other way around. Stories exist independently of their players. If you know that, the knowledge is power. Stories, great flapping ribbons of shaped space-time, have been blowing and uncoiling around the universe since the beginning of time, and they have evolved. The weakest have died and the strongest have survived, and they have grown fat on the retelling, stories twisting and blowing through the darkness. And their very existence overlays a faint but insistent pattern on the chaos that is history. Stories etch grooves deep enough for people to follow, in the same way that water follows certain paths down a mountainside. And every time fresh actors tread the path of the story, the groove runs deeper. This is called the theory of narrative. Oh, sorry. I blew my reading. This is called the theory... I was doing so well. This is called the theory of narrative causality. And it means that a story once started takes a shape. Unlike that sentence. Okay. It picks up... Everybody's going to be lost in these flapping ribbons of story. They'll have no idea what I'm talking about.
Dig deeper.
Dig. You guys realize we're still talking about why storytellings matter, right? And why you're in one. Okay. This is called the theory of narrative causality, and it means that a story once started takes a shape. It picks up... It picks up all the vibrations of all the other workings of that story that have ever been. This is why history keeps on repeating all the time. So 1,000 heroes have stolen fire from the gods. 1,000 wolves have eaten grandmother. 1,000 princesses have been kissed. 1,000,000 unknowing actors have moved unknowing through the pathways of story. It is now impossible for the third and youngest son of any king, if he should embark on a quest which has so far claimed his older brothers, not to succeed. Stories don't care who takes part of them. All that matters is that the story gets told, that the story repeats. Or, if you prefer to think of it like this, stories are a parasitical life form, warping lives in the service of only the story itself. It takes a special kind of person to fight back and become the bicarbonate of history. Once upon a time. Okay, Granny Weatherwax is, of course, the one they fight. No, the witches fight back, right? So it's like, on the one hand, we want these stories because they give us comfort and frames and resolution, and on the other, there's this, and this is, I think, when some people are worried about like the postmodernists breaking all the stories. There's a middle term in all of that where feminists and when I was in college, and I did. Yes, an entire term paper on fairy stories, which is somewhat why I have all these references, because like I read about it in college. Back in the 80s, the worry was largely psychoanalytical and feminist, and people were, wanting to either see the stories, particularly feminists, see the stories as traps for different kinds of expectations or things that you could, subvert and rewrite. And what, excuse me, I'm flapping around too much. The stories are flapping everywhere. What Pratchett does in his fantasy is play with that problem of the story. You want fairy stories to have particular kinds of shape, and yet you also want to be able to disrupt them. And in Witches Abroad, it turns out Granny Weatherax's sister is trying to play the part of the good witch by making all the stories play out, right? So she's got a princess, she's got a frog that she's turned into a duke, D-U-C, who she's trying to make the princess marry, and of course it's a frog, so why would you want to marry a frog? And Granny and the other witches have to show up and rescue the princess, in effect, whose name I'm forgetting, from the magic of the story. And Lily, Granny's sister, is creating all of these stories by way of standing between mirrors, right? She's got mirror magic, and so she's able to project herself around. It's very internet. She's able to project herself around by looking in the mirrors, and therefore resonating, right? That's a sort of perpetual reflection of stories.
Yes. The Hall of Mirrors.
Boom, 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 boom. Yeah.
Which is fantastic to think about, but also terrifying. Because if people are formed by stories, then we have an increase in the medium power of being able to tell them. That means an increase in formation and reformation, and then undoing potentially. As we've talked about the medium, you were talking a few streams ago about McLuhan's work on the radio and what the radio technology did to Europe. I mean, Europe inherited the radio technology, and suddenly it goes to war because it's flooded with particular stories, particular narratives suddenly being reformed, militarized. The transformation of the European peoples into tribal fascistic military machines comes through Marconi's radio technology. So we're kind of reworked in this way, but then it's like, okay, what happens if the technology increases? Time is shortened. That the time it takes to reform somebody in a story and undo them changes also. Yeah, it's interesting that he called it weather wax. It's like casting, the wax, the wax method for making jewelry. Do you know about that? They do the carving in the wax, and then once the design has been made, it's how this was made. This old Coptic cross here.
It's a lost wax.
Lost wax technique, exactly. And then the silver is thrown into it. It's like the mines. So it's interesting, this kind of weathering of the mentality and stories like this. The increase in technology, what happens when people are being continuously remolded?
Well, so I mean, it's interesting the way when people talk about fairy stories, including Tolkien, they like talking about this retelling process. And I mean, Tolkien's criticism, for example, of Beowulf studies, which I've said so many times, I never remember which context I've said it, but you know, he was upset with the critics for not paying attention to it as itself a particular crafted story, right? It has a particular shape that the artist gave it, the poet gave it, that people are always going through it looking for the elements that went into it, right? So instead of appreciating the actual story that is told by the Beowulf poet in whenever it's, you know, it's written down in around 1100 or around 1000, that they go through it and saying, well, this story element comes from this part, right? Here's a dragon, here's this feud, here's this, you know, history bit, and what's really interesting is where all those pieces came from. And when Tolkien, his other, so one, that eucatastrophe and the escape, recovery, consolation fantasy is one famous part of the fairy stories. The other is this concept of the soup of stories, and you know that you're going, that he's writing at a time, or he's talking at a time when folklore stories has been constantly going around and finding out how, as it were, you know, there's always this repetitions of the story, which both Pratchett and Tater are playing off of, that 1,000 times this has happened because we keep retelling it, and it's always happening over and over again. There's just this cauldron of story that they keep throwing new elements in and repeating it. And I mean, going back to our earlier meditation on the degree to which nothing means anything if everything refers constantly to everything else, it's like that soup imagery has always felt to me a little, it's funny because he's trying to do it's like saying there's different ingredients and you make a soup, but this feeling that all stories, I think this is the opposite version, all stories constantly always repeat off of each other. At what point is there a meaning in a story? I've tangled myself up. This sometimes happens. Well, not rare, not often, but sometimes.
Yeah, too many threads.
Oh well, so no, I mean, all of these fairy stories are supposed to be women's stories that they tell around spinning and weaving and stuff. So whatever we do right now works, right? Because we're women weaving stories. There you go, did it. So there.
Weaving. It seems like this idea of the eucatastrophe is answering the desire for justice. It's this need to have, you know, the wrongs written right again.
Well, it's justice is also, it's like it's meaningful causation, that there will be, you know, like the things have to happen correctly so that the wicked stepmother gets punished.
Yes. So that's also interesting with people that are wanting to constantly rewrite them to insert a new meaning into the stories, losing the referentiality. So even in that soup, losing which ones are looking at, you know, their other 999 tellings prior to this thousandth telling, but nothing causes anything else, because the way that we're working with them now is that it's all relative. So there's no referential, so there's no cause for anything. I don't know if I'm explaining this very well. Similar to the words that we were describing before, that everything is a container for meaning. The story itself is a container for meaning, and that people are using the story as a container for the causality and the need for justice for the eucatastrophe. And then emptying that. People are wanting to empty this to insert whatever they want in there. So not only not only is there anything objective for this entire, odd soup to be anchored onto or referring, but the reflection of all of these stories looking at each other and referencing each other are being emptied constantly at the same time as they're looking at each other. It's like a Rubik's Cube where the colors are changing because you don't have to have the same fixed colors, people are manipulating a Rubik's Cube, but you've got an aim of having on all sides red, green, yellow, whatever the other colors are. Imagine if you were dealing with a Rubik's Cube and someone was peeling off
the stickers
in the middle and slapping on a brand new color and then go, okay, solve it. It's an unsolvable Rubik's Cube of fairy story because there's no continuity, but like you don't even have fixed meaning while you're trying to solve it.
Right. Well, and what's funny is, so there are two different ways some people talk about saying in fairy stories. Now I don't remember who was saying this, whether it was Tolkien or somebody else. That the thing that happens in the story is the right thing, so sometimes the tests that the characters are given don't necessarily make sense except in story world, but they feel right in the midst of the storytelling. But on the other hand, and that does seem to satisfy because there's a feeling like, well, the characters think it's meaningful. So clearly it satisfies, right? This weird test that you had to do. Tolkien didn't like allegory. We all know that. That it's not satisfying when the story is simply standing in for this other argument, I think. So that people like the feeling in a fairy story is there's analogs and reference and maybe anagogy, right? When I was saying that this feeling of being in the story of the gospel of creation is contemplative and satisfying because it lifts you up into a mystery. And fairy stories do feel like they have that capacity to lift us up into mystery because they don't quite make sense necessarily, but then you can figure out how they make sense. But then there's another layer and it feels like there's yet more sense there. But I think what the sort of folklore study level is, like trickster stories are often, they're not just the trickster, just like it's like coyote stories or the spider stories on Anansi. Sometimes those, or Brer Rabbit, Rainer the fox, right? It's like there's a lot of stories where justice is not the end result. It's
they're not satisfying though. They leave you not full. You're not satiated by the tale. At least in my, you just said Anansi, so I'm like, yeah, that makes sense because it's a dissatisfying outcome. It's not a full meal, so to speak. But I don't know way I can describe it.
Okay, so now we have a problem that there is a premise that, fairy stories are always out there and they're always clashing around and potentially always available to us, and they have meaning in these mysterious ways. And then the other reality is that there are certain stories, like Snow White, that people have regularly read and declared to have deep and resonant meaning that's available to all ages for all time. Oh yes, she's going to deconstruct this, don't worry. Why would that be? What's funny about things like Snow White, when it's in the Grimm's collection, we're going to go there, that what you just said, not feeling satisfied by trickster stories, or some of the ones I've read, a fair variety of. I'm not a folklorist in the sense of I know tons of these, but I am curious about them. Things like the Navajo trickster stories, things you expect a kind of resolution in certain situations and they don't go there, and you say, okay, that those stories don't seem to keep getting retold. Whenever they get retold by Disney, for example, there are certain expectations and structures, and these stories. I do have a I have a historian's skepticism about how old most of these are. They feel old, but they're like, because you read them when you were 10. But the Grimms made their collection in a very particular moment in history, which was 1812-15. So that illusion of repetition and ever always there is, guess what, a feature of modernity.
Dun dun dun. What haven't they done?
It's all the 19th century. It's usually always the 19th century. The one place where I'm sort of in sympathy with the Great Tartaria, the Tartarian Empire thesis, is it does seem like something just got erased around the 19th century, and all this stuff got put in, including all these kind of virtual histories of things like, oh yes, the story world, the legends of the past, the ancientness of all of this. It's like, guys, they printed it in the 19th century, and the 19th century spent itself retelling all of this during the Industrial Revolution out of longing for a world that could feel dying, but had no clue what was. Or they invented it, or they made it up, because they mythologize, the countryside in particular ways in the 19th century because everybody's moving into the city.
I mean, is it their way of dealing with the grief of becoming hyper-urbanized?
Much of it, yes. And that's okay. So the spoiler alert on this, that when the Grimms collect their fairy stories, they have a number of informants, and the mythology that develops around it, they're peasant storytellers. They weren't. They were city people for the most part. And for the most part, they were fairly literate. And so what we get from the Grimms already is retellings of stories that they probably had read in books, right? There's a whole sort of layer, mythological layer of this is all oral storytelling. Well, yeah, sort of, in the sense that some of these storytellers are retelling stories. We can find the printed versions of what they were talking about, and Snow White's in fact one of them. There's an interesting back version of that one. I gave you some homework. Do you remember that?
You did.
I think you read. You read some of that.
I read a little bit of it.
That there's this 18th century version of Raquilda's, and you can look it up on Wikipedia too, where she is, weirdly enough, the child of Albertus Magnus, who's a magician, and it's the Wicked Witch. It's never mind Wicked, which is a different version, but the Maleficent, right? We're going to tell the story from the perspective of the Wicked Witch. Been there, done that already. It's an 18th century story. Sorry. I'm such a killjoy. You didn't expect that, did you guys? I think it's in the essay that I sent you.
Sorry, I had to plug my laptop.
Oh, okay. We're getting our references here, guys. There we go. So the original one is, okay. Another German source. This is G. Ronald Murphy's The Owl, the Raven, and the Dove, which is in Snow White. So we're going to get to that. He's talking about the sources of Snow White. Another German source acknowledged by the Grimms, so they say they got it from this, is the much lengthier story of Raquilda in Musaus's collection of German fairy tales, Volksmärchen der Deutschen, published initially in 1782, some 30 years prior to their own first edition. Musaus, I don't know how to say this, M-U-S-A umlaut U-S, style has much of the ironic and even satirical air of Perrault and Bazille, the great French collectors of stories, and seems far more destined to appeal to the rationally and sophisticated cynical adult reader than to children. His version begins with an un-Grimm-like lampoon of piety and devotion in the person of the excessively pro-clerical Count of Brabant, Gunderich de Pfaffenfreund, Gunderich, a clergy friend, who is always at mass or walking in processions, and who, thus restricted in his time for procreation, has no children. It is intimated that the understandably childless Countess of Brabant finally achieves pregnancy only after a very private sacramental confession. It's an anti-clerical version, right? So she has confession with Albertus Magnus, who is otherwise a great Dominican scholar, and by the 18th century has a reputation as a magician. Okay. Albertus Magnus, in turn, his remarkable interest in the future child noted by court gossip, then fashions a magic mirror, through his knowledge of the black arts as a gift for the child. I mean, this makes more sense of medieval sources, like, scrying mirrors and things like that. John Dee has one to talk to angels and everything. So in this version, the 18th century version, the husband is so pious that he neglects his wife. She goes to confession, has sex with the priest, gets pregnant. Magnus makes her child a black arts mirror. This child is Rakilda, who becomes the jealous mother of Blanca, the persecuted heroine. The mother uses the enchanted mirror in the traditional manner to find out who is the most beautiful in the land of Brabant. The mirror, however, is not capable of magic speech, but answers sensibly by showing an image, as mirrors will do. As Rakilda's behavior towards her more beautiful child deteriorates, in a nice touch, the mirror darkens and rusts to a degree that its image becomes faint and useless. The mother attempts 3 times to poison, and this one, it's the mother and the daughter. It's not a stepmother. So much for all the stepmothers. The Grimms put a stepmother in there because people were being bothered by the fact that it was a mother going after her own daughter. Yeah, I know. Okay. Guys, I'm going to break all of your illusions. We're going to give you a better story. Okay. Okay. So as Rakilda's behavior towards her more beautiful child deteriorates, mirror darkens. The mother attempts 3 times to poison her daughter, first with a half-poisoned apple, a pomegranate, the second time with perfumed soap, and the third time with a loving letter from herself laced with poisonous salts. She has forced the court doctor, Sambal the Jew. This is a very interesting element because Jews are often magicians in these medieval stories, these actual old stories. But in this one, she's forced the court doctor, Sambal the Jew, to concoct the poisons by bullying him by the offer of money. But each time his conscience gets the better of him and he merely injects a sleeping potion or strong narcotic into the apple and the soap and smears only sleep-inducing aromatic salts on the letter. He is punished by Rakilda for his lack of success at causing the death of her child by having his beard pulled out and his ears cut off. Dear. In contrast to the Grimms, therefore, Musaeus eschewed the mystical or magical, made the conscience of the professional doctor the instrument of mercy, and thereby enabled Blanca, Snow White, to awaken reasonably each time from the casket on her own. By turning her apparent death into a medically induced sleep, Musaeus makes the moment of crisis in the narrative fully responsive to reason and avoids any real need for supernatural agency to overcome death. The story's religious content is thus not found in the realm of the spiritual or mystical, but is in the realm of morality and conscience. And the dwarves are court dwarves. All right. So, this is what's so funny. It's like, talk about my life, right? I'm always wrecking people's fantasies. The Grimms, when they're making their collection, they're romanticizing stuff, quite literally. It's the 19th century romantic. And this is where it starts, right? With stuff like, oh, we're going to collect all these stories. They've got people who know some of the stories that they've read in books and are retelling them to them. And then guess what? The Grimms rewrite them themselves. So there's, yes, I know that. And this is in. Go ahead.
So they've retold them themselves and airbrushed a little, put a little Grimm magic on top.
Sprinkly, right? and they're actually really good. It's like, so we have this idea that fairy tales have a particular kind of style, right? That they are this sort of magnificent, sonorous. Once upon a time, and the feeling of the feeling of distance and it's ancient and past because it has this sort of biblical kind of character. Gee, I wonder why. Could the Grimms have done it on purpose? Okay, so here's Tater gives an example of retellings that they go through in their various editions, because they're actually, so what's funny about it is the Grimms start by saying, they're going to collect all these folk tales and they're going to do them from oral transcriptions. Well, guess what? People aren't necessarily very good storytellers. And so some of their original oral transcriptions are really boring. So they rewrite those. But they also understand that their audience is not going to be like fellow academics. It's going to be parents reading to their children. And so they rewrite them so that they're better to read out loud. Ironic or what, right? So here is the revisions to the Frog King Prince, which is, we said in Witches Abroad, is playing off of the Frog King, right? In the first edition of 1812, the Frog King, or Iron Heinrich, reads this way. Once upon a time there lived a princess. One day she went into the forest and sat down by a cool well. A golden ball was her favorite toy. She loved to amuse herself by throwing it up into the air and catching it when it came back down. Okay. In 1819, the first sentences read as follows. Once upon a time there lived a princess who was so bored that she didn't know what to do. She took a golden ball that she liked to play with and went out into the forest. In the middle of the woods there was a well with clear, cool water. She sat down next to it and threw the ball in the air, then caught it, and that's how she amused herself. It's still not very... You're not going to, like, make movies of that, right? It's like, great, she's playing with the ball. No! It's boring.
No, it's bored girl with the balloon. We'll spice it up a bit.
By 1857, the opening to the tale had lost its choppy quality, says Tater, and took a lyrical turn so that it produced, when read out loud, the effect of a narrative that flows naturally in a way the unedited version did not. These are literary constructions. Our, quote, oral fairytale. It's like ancient wisdom. No, they're the Grimms. Once upon a time, when wishes still came true, there lived a king who had beautiful daughters. The youngest was so lovely that even the sun, which had seen so many things, was filled with wonder when it shone upon her face. They're hitting their stride now, see? There was a deep, dark forest near the king's castle, and in that forest, beneath an old linden tree, was a spring. There's a well in the other one. So if you're going to start doing like folklore analyses on this and say, oh, springs are this and that, the Grimms put it in, okay? Because they're good storytellers. But it's like, why are they good storytellers? Like, what are they actually doing in their storytelling? Okay. Whenever the weather turned really hot, the king's daughter would go out into the woods and sit down at the edge of the cool spring. And if she was bored, she would take out her golden ball, throw it up in the air, and catch it. That was her favorite plaything. And now, so obviously, scholars get this, right? It's like, and Tolkien sort of understood. I mean, he studied a lot of how things get rewritten. It's not just that the stories are told over and over again. Actual artists are rewriting them to make them better.
Which is interesting too. Because then we have to think about the stories not as neutral artifacts, but as directly influenced by the artists that have created them or recreated them or retold them. Which brings us to a way different kind of Rubik's Cube to deal with.
Oh my goodness! Could we be in the craft of an artist? Could we be living in a created world with meaning and structure because the storyteller is making it? Oh dear. Shall we read Snow White now?
I think we should.
Off my lap. Okay, so when Trina Sharthyman did it, she used the Grimm's version, which was a good, although translated by Paul Hines, who I don't know who is otherwise. But she has, so we don't need to read the whole thing because we didn't. But anyway, the opening, right? This goes with this picture where the mother is. I love this picture. It's so beautiful. And the mother is sitting there with her hand out. She's pricked her finger on the needle, the sewing needle, and it's got 3 drops of blood. Once in the middle of winter, when snowflakes were falling like feathers from the sky, the queen sat sewing by a window, and its frame was of black ebony. As she sewed, she glanced up at the snow and stuck her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell into the snow. Since the red seemed so beautiful against the white, she thought to herself, if only I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, as dark as ebony. Soon afterward, she gave birth to a little girl who was as white as snow and as red as blood, and whose hair was as black as ebony. She was named Snow White. And the very moment the child was born, the queen died. Now, knowing what we do from the example of the frog prince, we get that that's the Grimms, right? That they put in all of that beautiful imagery of the feathers and the snow and the sort of, including like the actual 3 drops of blood. 3 is, it shows up in stories a lot, but earlier versions, quote versions of Snow White, like it's not they were killed. There's another one. I've read so many today. It's sometimes it's more gruesome. Like they see pools of blood and blah 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 blah. That everything in that paragraph is crafted by the Grimms to give you that feeling.
Yeah, it's painted. The imagery is painted very clearly,
as beautifully and as exquisitely as Hyman is illustrating their version.
Even down to the choice of colors in that opening scene. It's very striking.
Yeah, you have this habit of doing, like, noticing dangerous things, and one of the dangerous things that Tater noticed, and no, it's like I was laughing about it when we were prepping because it's in Tater, that she recognizes that the Grimm's fairy tales become, recommended by a certain group of people in the 30s in Germany. And that German, people are stuck with thinking, she's saying, the Grimms have had a powerful effect beyond the borders of German-speaking countries. Few cultural documents have played so key a role in constructing a national image. If the first association of many people in this country, the United States, to the word Germany is to Hitler and the Holocaust, the second is more likely to the Grimm's child stories and household tales. This odd juxtaposition has resulted in a strange conflation of horror and fantasy, linking Germany with what the historian Saul Friedlander has described as a cult of death and kitsch in the popular imagination. The Grimm's children's stories and household tales has been denounced precisely for its narrative tolerance of these two extremes. Quote, this is Saul Friedlander. Typical of the German fairy tale is the juxtaposition of the commonplace and the intimate, with the horrors of death and all the tortures of calculated cruelty. And those colors. Stop noticing these things.
That was the first thing I thought of.
Black and white, come on.
I was like, oh,
it's
red,
white, Snow White, red,
black and white. What does that remind me of?
Clearly Germany.
Yeah. There's a reason why it resonated so much, If you're a synesthetic person and you're reading something and you can actually see the visuals, I was like, oh, wow. Snow White Waffen. It's very funny.
You're going to get us into trouble,
I'm sorry.
Stop seeing stuff that connects to other stuff.
I know I'm not supposed to be knitting these fairy threads together, am I?
but this is a sort of fear that people have constantly. It's like if we associate this with that, then it becomes part of the story and it's like resonates out and becomes meaningful, I guess.
But this is stupid because instead of realizing that yes, that's what happens. I mean, no, but it is dumb. It's stupid because this is just the human mind. This is what the human mind does, and it's either you're going to do it consciously, like I did this morning. It's like, oh, wow. Or you're going to do it subconsciously because you're not that kind of, you don't have that kind of neurology that's doing it, that is liminal or whatever, it's a subliminal thing. But denying the effect is stupid because it's going to happen anyway. All of advertising runs on this fact. All of it. Edward Bernays wrote his book Propaganda based on this understanding of the mind that the human beings need to put these kinds of threads together. So we're still living in a world that uses it. It's just that I made the connection I made this morning, and then people can say, oh well, you can't do that. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't do it, but clearly there's some very strong resonance that is a kind of fairy residue on a culture that makes them sort of pick up on this thing and think, okay, we like those colors. Why do you like those colors so much? if you've heard, if you,
Well, so it
not
could
that I'm
have
saying
been
this
the
is the
Grimms
cause,
become
but
very, I mean, they are incredibly popular in the 19th and early 20th century, and I do believe Hitler recommended
yes,
them to the Germans. So, because the sort of
but isn't it
story as
interesting?
culture formation and folk formation.
Yes.
But I mean, what's interesting is like saying what people in, and we've talked about this. Well, we talk about this a lot in our writing of our poem, that our imagery needs to be, I mean, purposeful, but not always. We don't always know why we're choosing certain things because it's just right, and then later we find out it was even more right than we considered.
Mm.
But that everything can't relate to everything else, right? There has to be some, I mean, actual story structure, actual cosmological meaningfulness of things being chosen. And
Mm.
what I think the thing that's frustrating about it is people can't. The
Well, they
Grimms
don't
did
have
all
the
of this on
grammar.
purpose. They are, and
Yeah,
figuring
yeah.
out what they're drawing off of hopefully actually matters for what we think the stories mean, because those artists put it in there on purpose. And you could say, well, they're not
Mm.
necessarily, consciously thinking of why they have all of these associations, but there are other ways in which we can see they took Rakildus, changed it, romanticized it, and came out with a different kind of story, which is not the Albertus Magnus had a magic black mirror that he gave to the child, Rakildus, and she used it to try to kill her daughter, right? It's like there's some structural elements in there, but Snow White is not that same meaning.
No, because as artists, they've tried to make it sink
Right.
into the psyche, which, it makes sense because it's like, I mean, as like I was saying before, things have a resonance, they kind of stain a culture. You say Midas, well, you should think gold instantly. Like there's this understanding of a connection between, the word associations or, a color and this and that kind of thing. When you're living in that particular fairy soup, certain things will go together after a while because the artists that have created the stories have made those connections, and they're so deep and they get repeated so many times that they're kind of working on autopilot in a way. So that's why I was saying, like, I was struck by it because it was kind of like reading another story from another culture. Like, I reference the Greek stories a lot, but it's kind of looking at it and saying, oh wow, they've done a very similar thing, where you talk about the Gorgon Medusa. Suddenly, okay, saying that, if you've been reading those stories often enough, it will give you very strong imagery almost instantly, and a lot of associations that come with it. So they have, the Germans have managed to do this in a way that's sort of like, okay, we're going to pick up on the imagery from this particular literature,
Right.
and then pull it into another field of reference and a field of use, which, I mean, it is scary to think about how that can happen, because the same thing as some audio technology, you're using an existing grammar of fairy imagery to then pull into a different use.
Well, so the most famous
In a
example,
different way.
and this is one of the things that I've referenced reading this stuff in college in the 80s, and I did the fairy stories essay in a class on gender studies, which it's like I remember the repertoire of people. Jack Zipes did a lot of analysis of fairy stories. I can't remember who else I was reading at the time. It's like, there's the Mad Women in the Attic. Gilbert and Grabar and Gilbert did a lot of analysis. It's like there was a huge like subculture of analyzing fairy stories in the 80s, but they were all playing off of one author in particular, Bruno Bettelheim. Bettelheim is very interesting. I mean, I read his uses of enchantment back in the 80s because I was reading this paper on fairy stories. When I showed up here at the University of Chicago, he had something of a reputation here because, he'd been here at something called the Orthogenic School, which I'm not quite clear about. But he was also when we taught history of European civilization, there's a selection in one of our history of European civilization readers where he's analyzing what happened at, oh yes, the concentration camps. And it was an early essay where he's talking about how the camps were actually breaking down people psychologically. So he was apparently a psychologist, and his reading of the fairy stories and uses of enchantment is like just as Tolkien is deeply embedded in all of this, so is his. And I'm pretty sure Tater references him. I forgot to pay attention to exactly where, but it's like everybody's going to reference Bettelheim at some point on how maybe she did or didn't. Oh well, anyway, maybe she didn't. I'm making it up. It's a story now. That everybody's going to reference Bettelheim because he did a Freudian reading of the stories. And yes, right. And so if you in fact know that Snow White is all about coming of age and puberty and Oedipal conflicts, oh right, you're affected by uses of enchantment because that's been out there in the conversation for a while. And then I did a little Wikipedia reading this morning, and apparently he lifted it and plagiarized it from somebody else, and that's apparently now really famous. It wasn't in the 80s when I read stuff. And even more interesting, when he was hired at the University of Chicago, again, according to Wikipedia, it could be a fairy story, he had no academic training whatsoever in any of the fields that he was hired in. He made it all up. He was a really good storyteller. And it's like, was it in art history? Was it in literature? Who knows? He kind of showed up as a refugee from Austria and presented himself and managed to talk his way into getting a job at the University of Chicago in the Swords School. And his psychoanalytic reading of the pubertal crises, like the dwarves are small men and stuff like that, is now standard in the way people talk about the stories. But it's
thanks to this guy who hustled his way in.
Thanks to Bruno Bettelheim's hustle. That's a good fairy story, don't you think?
That's impressive.
Anyway, but so of course in a Freudian version, it's all about, the crises of menstruation and sex and...
Well, he's just demonstrated beautifully what happens when the associations are fixed, It's that's the Freudian reading. And so people have run with it. So it's like it takes a long time to come out of that a particular, I don't know how I would describe it like this, but this
fog.
Yeah, well, this tradition of interpretation, shall we say, which is Freudian, because
so the Grimms are creating a romantic version in the 19th century. Freud obviously comes along. Freud, whatever he was a great storyteller because everybody's convinced that he did something analytical and scientific. He didn't. He wrote myths. And I've taught enough of his texts fairly carefully in the history of European civilization to be able to say this with some confidence. If you follow Freud's logic through all of his, quote, proofs, he's basically weaving myths. He's a great rhetorician. He's a great storyteller. And here comes Bruno Bettelheim. I mean, just to give you a flavor of the way Bettelheim plays with this kind of stuff. He's talking about why in Snow White there's a hunter, right? In Snow White, as in Little Red Riding Hood, a male who can be viewed as an unconscious representative of the father appears, the hunter who's ordered to kill Snow White but instead saves her life. Who else but a father substitute would seem to acquiesce to the stepmother's dominance and nevertheless, for the child's sake, dare to go against the queen's will? This is what the Oedipal and adolescent girl wishes to believe about her father, that even though he does as the mother bids him, he would side with his daughter if he were free to, tricking the mother as he did so. Why are rescuing male figures so often cast in the role of hunters in fairy tales? While hunting may have been a typically masculine occupation when fairy stories came into being, This is much too easy an explanation. At that time, princes and princesses were as rare as they are today, and fairy tales simply abound with them. But when and where these stories originated, hunting was an aristocratic privilege, which supplies a good reason to see the hunter as an exalted figure like a father. It goes on, and it's like, it's this kind of, and psychoanalytic literature like Freud and Jung is full of this sort of stuff. It's like this projection of this ancient world, that swirling stories. It's like, guess what, guys? As historians, we know that's not true. I mean, the hunting as an aristocratic pursuit, yes, but the feeling of, oh yes, these stories come out of this mist of time that we have no access to. Yes, we do, and they're those manuscripts that they're using to make pictures of for the movies that we rely on to know what the stories were when they were doing this in the Middle Ages. And it ain't this. She says categorically. hoping you go read Jan Ziolkowski's fairy stories. I put it on our reading list. Like all of this, I can footnote everything. And it's mainly on our website under behind the scenes, right? If you look at behind the scenes, I'm looking it up so I can give you the proper title because it was a little complicated. Oh, come on, go. Behind the scenes. Jan Ziolkowski, who has done, among other things, a 6-volume series on one story and the way it becomes, in the modern period, the sort of focus of a lot of medievalisms. It's the jungle, Our Lady's Juggler. But he also did one, Fairy Tales from Before Fairy Tales, the Medieval Latin Past of Wonderful Lies. And he goes through things like Little Red Riding Hood and shows how there are stories about a little girl in Red Hood and stuff like that who gets eaten by a wolf. But most of the structure of these stories that we think of as timeless is provably and manifestly modern.
So they've been reworked in the modern context, which means they've been imprinted by modernity, and the artists that have they've infused the stories with modernity. So we're referencing them and not pre-modern storytelling. Now that's interesting because that changes the soups as well. That changes the soup. That changes the Rubik's Cube completely, yet again.
The Grimms are basically doing what Tolkien did, which was write stories that should have been.
Yeah. But if they're the only ones we're referencing, we're stuck chronologically somehow.
We do have this Tartarian Empire problem, which is sort of like, where is the past, right? Is there an actual past that we can have access to? We started the stream tonight talking about Christ, right?
Yes.
Is there an actual past of the story that we're actually living in?
Can I answer that?
Well, let's the boomerang is still out and it hasn't hit the kangaroo yet.
Okay.
What did the Grimms do? Still right. And this so much of this relies on this premise. Like, so Bettelheim comes along, psychologizes all the stories in the 60s and 70s. The feminists come along in the 80s and say, no, women are being oppressed by these stories, which they're reading through Bettelheim. Freudian version, right? So the oppression is of a Freudian structure. The Grimms stories are often used as the proof of how oppressive and bourgeois all of this stuff was.
Okay, I'm hearing a lot of oppression.
Because Snow White's housekeeping, right? Oh my goodness. Well, of course she's housekeeping. The Grimms are writing it for the 19th century. To sell books. Did we mention we have a Kickstarter?
Keeping houses.
They're selling books, and we showed you with the frog prints, right? They rewrite these things to be more readable because they want to sell more books. And yet, let's go through Snow White just a little bit. So they're different elements, and I promised I wouldn't show all of Trina Chartheiman, so you have to buy the book. But so we have the mother, Snow White's mother, who pricks her finger, right? We have Snow White's relationship with her beautiful stepmother, and I do like that Hyman draws the stepmother as actually beautiful, right? She's not like wicked. I mean, she is wicked, but she's clearly bothered by the beauty of the younger woman, and yet herself very striking and beautiful long blonde hair, where Snow White has black hair. In this image, Snow White has a bird on her shoulder, which becomes significant in the Grimm version. When Snow White runs away, I didn't put the hunter in, but whatever. She's surrounded by the dwarves, who Hyman draws very individually, right? They have different characters in their faces, but they're not comic, right? They're men, just short. The stepmother in her mirror, we see her now here racked with the need to make herself ugly so that she is disguised, and goes and offers the apple to Snow White, right? So we have these different, the stepmother, the dwarves, the apple, the mirror. This is a concluding image of the stepmother when she's in all of her magnificent jewelry and finery, right? Everything that Hyman puts in details, like she's got this snake on her bracelet, right? And all of these incredible cameo imagery, pendants and things on her belt and so forth. And the Snow White surrounded by the dwarves, the prince coming and looking at her in this glass casket, right? So these are those will be the elements that most people recognize as Snow White. Now, I mean, one of the interesting things about the visuals of Snow White, as people understand, is that the Disney version influenced a lot of the things that people think belong in the Snow White iconography. Although I haven't done a full study of all of the background pictures from the 19th century, but you go to Wikipedia, you see some of these elements are already there, like the casket, the glass casket, right? So what do we see in this mirror? Here's the mirror, but it's blank. What did the Grimms put in? That really matters.
I can't see it. It's blank.
It's blank. Okay, so we need G. Ronald Murphy to help us. Because we know the thing to know about Ron Murphy is A, he's a medievalist. B, he's a literature professor. C, he's a Jesuit. I met him, and I fangirled him, and then he fangirled me, because I used his book on the Old Saxon Gospel Harmony, the Heliand, in my first book, and I called him my Virgil, which he was delighted by. He thought that was great. It's like my Virgil, and I think I picked that up. It's like, talk about story levels, right? I picked that up from somebody else as a phrase, like our Virgil, because it's like Dante, right? Virgil's going to lead us through this story, and Murphy led me through reading the Heliand, which we probably should do like a whole stream on. He's also done books on things like the Parzival, Wolfram von Eschenbach's Grail quest, which matters. He's done a wonderful book on the image of the tree, the tree of salvation in the Norse and Christian stories. So he is literally an expert in the way in which stories get translated into new cultures, and the way they get blended, the way in which the Christian stories will be incorporated. The point about the Heliand story is, for example, at the baptism of Christ, when Christ comes out of the water, Jesus comes out of the water, in the Gospels, a dove is present in some ways, right? Either it's physically there or it descends, or it's like a dove, right? In the Heliand version, there's an amazing twinning with the Odin image of the ravens that sit on his shoulder, memory and mind, right? And so Christ comes out of the water. There's the dove, which then is somehow like face vase magic. You can see one, you can see the other. It's blended. You see both the dove and the ravens. It's incredibly beautifully done, and you can read about that in my book, which I use his reading to see how stories happen and reference and play out. Murphy, whose reading we're about to share with you on Snow White, knows how stories work, right? How they play, how they get retold, how the power of the imagery is transformed through reference and repetition and rewriting. And he did a whole book on the Grimms called The Owl, the Raven, and the Dove. Maybe I should tell you the subtitles so that you appreciate how cool it is. And this is also on the reading list. the Owl, the Raven, the Dove, the religious meaning of the Grimm's magic fairy tales. Are we ready? You did read enough in the so now you see what I sent you. It's like,
yes,
this chapter on Snow White is by one of the like leading medieval scholars on layers of storytelling. And he's trying to say, look, they knew Rakildus, they knew this enlightened version. They're going to rewrite it so that Snow White now has a deeper significance than the Enlightenment. Oh yeah, it's all trickery.
Mm-hmm. As you were describing that, it was I'm recalling Moses compiling the Genesis story as a kind of the similar thing to kind of establish the pattern of origin, but also all of the imagery there, because he focused a lot on inserting particular scenes with animals and things in there to anchor parts of the story. So yeah, you said ravens, and I thought a few things came to mind.
So he does. So I had that. I'm pulling stuff, and it's actually working. And guys, we're running late, but you know, you can watch this on recording. That and you can pause and consider how much wisdom we are imparting to you in such a compressed form. The boomerang's still out, and we will keep reminding you that the boomerang's still out. And I threw it out 2 hours ago, and it will come back. I promise you.
It's spinning somewhere over the Pacific.
You know, flat or globe world, that boomerang is way far out. Okay. We saw what Bettelheim did with that hunter. Murphy is way more interesting. So Bettelheim just says, oh, it's, you know, father figure in competition with the stepmother, blah blah blah.
The Freudian
version, right? So in the if you actually read Murphy, you realize that whole huntsman thing is Grimm, and not in a Grimm way, right? So Wilhelm then introduces an incident that is not at all in the manuscript. When the queen calls the huntsman to take Snow White out into the woods and kill her, the story verges off in the direction of classical mythology. When Jocasta, the queen, the mother of Oedipus, wanted to get rid of her child, she too ordered one of her herdsmen to take the infant out into the wilderness and to abandon him on a wild mountainside to be devoured by the wild animals. So it has nothing to do with daughters, it's Oedipus, right? But so Jocasta is sending Oedipus out. The herdsman, however, took pity on the helpless young child and spared him. The herdsman returns to her and says nothing to the queen about letting the baby go free. First layer. Wilhelm Grimm then interweaves another ancient myth with this one. There is no substitution of an animal for the baby in the Oedipus myth. This brief allusion to the Oedipus story is therefore deftly interwoven with the biblical story of Abraham, in which an animal is substituted by the parent for the child who is spared. In Genesis 22, Abraham lowers his knife and does not kill his son Isaac on the altar, but lets his son go free and substitutes a wild ram caught in a nearby thicket for the child. Again, Bettelheim claims that it's about mothers and daughters, right? But this is the Abraham and Isaac story, so she's spared. The herdsman in Snow White kills a nearby young wild boar in order to bring back its lungs and liver. Lunge and Leber, the alliteration helps make the act seem northern and medieval. To Snow White's mother, the queen. He's not done yet. Wilhelm then...
This is cool. I'm enjoying this a lot. It's funny. It's so ironic. Keep going.
It's art, right? It's like Grimm did this on purpose, and it's the overlaying and interlaying of all these stories. Wilhelm then completes the incident by giving it a Germanic twist at the end. In the myth of Siegfried, the dragon slayer, the same request is made by the treacherous Regan, who shows Sigurd how to kill the dragon by digging a camouflaged pit in the earth and striking up from below. Regan hopes, however, that the venomous blood will then pour into the pit and destroy the hero, and the treasure will be his. This is the passage in Pedro Colom's retelling. Okay, and it's long, right? Sigurd takes the heart out and roasts it. Takes a heart from the dragon and roasts it. Okay. When the equally cunning queen sees the cut out lungs and liver provided by the hunter, she has them roasted triumphantly as if she were incorporating Snow White's magic beauty into herself, just as Regan wished to incorporate into himself the magic wisdom of the serpent, the dragon. What the stepmother eats, however, is the life of a pig. Okay, so whatever Bettelheim did with that, right? Grimm, it's like taking a exquisitely crafted stained glass window with layers and layers of imagery and references to the classical tradition, the Germanic tradition, and the biblical tradition, and claiming that it's nothing but, you know, puberty. I mean, it may be puberty, but you know, it's like this kind of ham-fisted psychologizing of the 20th century eradicates the level of art that actually went into the crafting of these stories by the Grimms, whose are the version that we're using in all modern retellings of them.
Yeah, it's like taking a cathedral and building an office an office building over the top of it, isn't it? You just think, where's all the detail gone? It's no, we don't need that. We just need this. It's almost making utility out of the story and then not having the reference. That's why I was laughing, because they've taken something which is like pretty heavy with Semitic references, right? We're talking about Abraham and Isaac. I mean, this is the foundational myth for the Hebrew people. This is it. And then, like, you know, kind of like covering it up and having this, or just, you know, that all of these other references and making it into a utility story.
Yep.
Far out.
So everybody keeps doing this to.
This is what. Okay, so but this makes sense now. Why these stories are used by people that want to create a utility culture and make people behave as though they are utilities instead of people with souls and minds and spirituality and complexity. You know, it's a industrialization via utility story.
I mean, but what's interesting is the Grimms were actually doing this as Christian artists, and Bettelheim obviously completely de-Christianizes them.
So they've set the precedent, because it's like the influence of it's like the influence of modernity on their retelling, on their structuring, on their creation, right. And then what you can do with the, you know, another step further, when you're so far away from the medieval, by looking at the myths as Freud did. You're not even looking at the complexity of the ingredients in the fairy tale in the first place, because you're not reading it with all of these different dimensions. That's very, very interesting.
Well, I mean, in effect, the Grimms wrote great works of literature in the 19th century with layers of resonance in them on purpose, which we can see them rewriting the stories that they collected and making them, you know, it's like saying Dickens' Christmas Carol was, you know, an eternal story that, you know, has, I mean, yeah, the 19th century was a great era of storytelling and art and poetry and medievalism, but it was also... But
you need to know their references in order to understand their retelling. So what we're doing is we're only referencing their retelling, and we've completely, like, as a civilization, completely... it's a complete amnesia of all of the references that they've used in their story.
Right.
We're not even getting them. We're missing them. We don't understand them. We don't see them. So we don't have any other way of interpreting the stories except for the proposed interpretation. You know, the proposed mode of analysis, which is Freudian.
Right.
Or however someone else wants to say it, it's a story that...
Well, they've been de-Christianized, and talk about what the Nazis did, right?
Yes,
They
yes,
completely eradicated the sense of there being, I mean, so that, you know, the Nazis wanted them as German folklore. It's therefore appropriate that I started with Indiana Jones and his reading of a fake manuscript with
yeah.
the Nazi. Right? And we descended into hell.
But
And then it's like,
that's why I was
yeah.
laughing, like appropriating those people, appropriating them as German folklore, and that's why I was chuckling because I was thinking it's a Semitic, like this is, you know, it's
Oh,
got Semitic
yes.
roots. You know,
Yes.
so like, how do you take away these stories when they're anchored in the Christian mind, which is a Semitic mind? I mean, this is like it. I will say this. I will state this very plainly as a Coptic person to say, yes, it's the Semitic world, the Semitic psyche. So you've got but Christic Semitic psyche, and then you've got a bunch of crazy people that are trying to reformat a national mentality on a retelling, which, I mean, it's like my head can't handle this. It hurts to think about this. Recycling fairy imagery for this kind of machinery. It hurts.
Well, I mean, it makes sense of why they felt so fractured and confusing in the post World War II era.
Yeah. Like I can feel it in my head just thinking about that. It's a block. No wonder the Rubik's Cube is broken completely. And then the psyche is broken because they can't return to their own the roots of their own culture. All they have is this repeat of anti-fairy.
Mm-hmm.
They're stuck in it over and over and over and over again.
Well, so in the image I'm showing right now, there's nothing in the mirror. Right? They see nothing in the mirror. The mirror is horrified, right? This is great. Yeah. Trina Schardheimer detail. It's like the mirror is going, because their face is around it. It's like there's nothing in it because they're never actually, but I mean, and you could see this is my intense frustration forever as a medievalist, right? What's interesting is the ancient world is considered like cool and woo-woo, right? And the medieval is a source for cool decorative motifs. I'm not sure, but the when you say you're medievalist, is you're one of those dark age people. Yes, yes, the age of light that the Enlightenment decided was going to eradicate and restory as the period in which Albertus Magnus gets the mom pregnant, right? We can't possibly believe that those little men that live in the woods and take in travelers and wear hoods are the good guys. Murphy does a nice job on this. It's like when the prince comes along and he's expecting to take lodge for the night with the little men in the woods. Who are they? Could it be? Say the word. Monks. And of course, the Grimms are kind of like sneaking stuff in because I think they're in the Lutheran context. I'm not sure, but I mean, this is what's so funny. It's like what's haunting the story world.
That was the word I was thinking. We're haunted by it.
Cannot see it. Cannot look in the mirror. I mean, so there's interesting. Okay, it's like all you see. This is from a series. This is a Disney princess from a series on the 7 Deadly Sins, and here Snow White is lust, right? I think that's Snow White. I hope that I got the right one. Right? It doesn't matter. They're all the Disney princesses are sins of some sort, right? And it's like all you see is Snow White. It's surrounded by little men and sleeping in their beds, right? They sleep in a dormitory and they're in fact very good housekeepers, and she takes a little taste from each of their I don't know about the mining, right? That's a little confusing, but it's like there's so many ways they clearly are like talk about like what would the English write about if they have no monks left, but they know that they stole all their property?
Yeah.
Awkward.
Yeah.
and they just grub around in the world, in the earth, for gemstones and gold and stuff to, I don't know, decorate their churches, right? So you know, it's interesting that I'm pretty sure the Grimms were Lutheran. Somebody look it up for me. Grimm's. I can't do it on my iPad because I don't have my keyboard with me.
Now that's interesting.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's a lot of Germany, just like England goes through. I mean, well, England sort of more purely goes through the crisis because the Reformation just destroys everything, and the people that are left as Catholics are resistant, but they don't have the physical institutions anymore. Germany is, of course, A, not unified until the 19th century into Germany, and B, fractured into all of these different regions. So Bavaria is very Catholic, and I don't know, Saxony is very Lutheran, and it's all mixed up, and I don't know which region is which. In the, you know, for all of modernity, Germany is literally schizophrenic because A, it doesn't exist, and B,
I noticed in the article that the first thing that jumped out at me is that it's described Germanese plural, which fits because that's what it is. It's not a unification, not a unified place. It's a bunch of side quests all stuck together
constantly, and even to the point of like which High German or Low German, Snavischen or Snavischen or Snaveisen or what. I mean, it's like that the dialects are not standardized until the 19th century. It was like which ones counts as the national language. I'm a little bit riffing off the top of my head on this. I don't really know Germany that well in the modern period, but I know that that whatever they're doing in the 30s, it's new, right? Because Bismarck had only just done it in the late 19th century to create a political entity of the German state. Okay.
Oh, no, this is having a lot of like there's a lot of things clicking now. Yeah, this makes sense. You don't have a unified. There's no unification religiously. That's been fractured. Linguistically, there's no unification. Right. Politically, there's no unification. Fairy tales, no unification. So you're dealing with this cauldron of competing energy and desire for coherency, but intensely mystical.
Oh yeah, the Germans are so mystical. I mean, that's in my normal day job life. Mainly, what I spend is reading, you know, German mysticism. It's called Benedictine. It's the monks, right? Or it's Hildegard, who is another of our great models for our Draco Alchemicus, right? Her allegories of the soul and the city and the creation. The Germans are intensely mystical. All of what you're saying is true. And what they had in the 19th century, interesting, was the Grimm's fairy tales to give them a sense of being German.
But it's an incomplete story, which is why it brings us back to the beginning, that there is only one story ultimately, and that if we've smashed the Gothic cathedral of the fairy tale and created this utilitarian office space, which has given us something like a 19th century nationalism to make everything cohesive. Right. It's practical, right? I mean, it works. So so-called it works, but it's not satisfying to the psyche. It's not satisfying to the soul because it's not complete. The references have been lost. The mind still can't rest. It's not able to fix on the foundation of that fairy tale because it's lost its references, and so it's not going to sit in a stable way. I don't know if this is making sense, but this kind of what this reminds me of is like a kind of catalyst for fan fiction frenzy.
Mm. Well, I mean, in some ways you could say the Nazis are like the epitome of fan fiction frenzy. I mean, in their invention of mythologies, and I've seen things like pictures, well, one, their color scheme, but things like parades that they do with invented mythological characters. It's like this
hijacking the desire for a true mythology and a true procession and all of that kind of thing.
But in like the psychedelic drug version of nothing making sense.
Yeah. Fear and Loathing in
Berlin,
yeah. Horror.
Yes, it is. Yeah. And it's like this is, so I have right now, I did find on Wikipedia, there's, some 19th century illustrations of the story, and the glass coffin seems to be a standard, right? This clear glass coffin, which is interesting. There are some, this looks sort of French to me, but the Witch Queen and Snow White. So I think it is fair to say that there is the sexual tension and the envy is real in the story. But obviously one of the things that people have tended to do with all of these stories, I mean, they come out of the 19th century, and the 19th century is such a fractured time of the industrialization and the movement of people into the cities and the loss, all of that. The Grimms fed off of that feeling of loss, right? We've lost the old world. We've lost the old world. My entire field, right? Medieval studies comes out of that moment, right? It's like this feeling of the world has changed, or, in England, they're trying to recover the Gothic because they threw out the church in the 16th century, and they'll make new churches in the Gothic style and Parliament and things like that. But this fracturing of the whole world that took place after the French Revolution, after Napoleon marches through the middle of the continent, disrupts everything in Germany, all of that it's like this incredible fervor of the lines of history being broken, right? So some of what goes on, people try to pretend that, I think I got my slides in the wrong order. There are historical reference to it. So go through these pictures of mirrors and go to, for example, there's two towns, and I won't remember which they are, look them up on Wikipedia, that claim to have the historical Snow White. One seems moderately credible, as like there was a woman who had a child and it was difficult marriage, stuff and so forth. That's what I'm showing now. The other one was completely made up by like a guy who said, oh yeah, it could be us because we have a mine nearby and there were dwarves. and that desire to be in the story, right, is saying our town is the source of that story. And so they're taking something that's very clearly, if we do the literary analysis, invented by the Grimms in the 19th century as a structure, and saying that's ours. That was our, it's like, saying that the real events of this fairy story happened in our town, which then gives your town more reality because it fits with the fairy story. It's a sort of fascinating problem, right? So we go back to the mirrors upon mirrors. Some of the meditation has also been on, like, why is there a mirror in the story? I'll go back to the big mirror that she has in the picture. Go back to the mirror. We're going back to the mirror. Any mirror as big as the ones that we usually imagine having cannot exist until the 17th century, because there's no technology for making large plate glass mirrors until the Venetians come up with it in the 17th century. And Louis XIV, the reason he makes the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles is because it's like basically covering the whole room in gold. It's or computer boards or something, right? It's the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles is like the modern villain's version of giant tech screens or something, right? I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. It's like Times Square in Versailles.
Yes. Yeah, like you had nothing but moving billboards, right? That was the Hall of Mirrors. So these big mirrors, if the story depends on having that kind of mirror, it's a completely modern story. Now, some of the you could say, well, no, there are mirrors before that. Now I'm going to the mirrors. We know from the 15th century there's good enough mirrors technically to actually have proper reflections in them. Prior to that, mirrors are not that great, right? And like high medieval mirrors, they're little compact things size, they're like little hand things. The glass technology, again, it's the tech. The glass technology is not good enough, and the silver backing and things like that until the 15th century, and therefore there's whole schools of argument saying, oh yes, from the 15th century you start having the sense of the self, the selfie, because the mirrors, the mirrors from the 15th century start being clear enough that you could look in them and actually see something that looked like yourself. This one's showing an artist using her mirror to do a self-portrait, so a selfie. You can see where I was on the internet this afternoon. But there's also these famous pictures by things like Van Eyck. This is the Arnolfini wedding, where the mirror, again, it's like putting this high tech thing in the picture. The mirror is a convex, one of those bulby ones, right, that shows the whole room. So, you know, like what kind of mirror the queen is looking in to get the truth is a kind of interesting tech question.
It is. Medium problem.
It's a total medium problem. If she's using one of the old, like if she's using an ancient mirror that were made just of polished metal, we're still recording. We are
like the Egyptian style that they used to redirect light beams around rooms for lighting. Yeah.
But those the old style mirrors, when Paul says through a glass darkly, he means mirrors aren't that great. You can't see in them clearly. All you see in a first century mirror is a metallic something. Yeah, it's like looking at yourself in a car side.
So he couldn't have written that phrase if it was now.
Because now we see mirrors.
There are no dark glasses. We got high definition LG screens.
He would write it up to different. It wouldn't be darkly now. It would be mirror imaged or deceptively or pixelated or something like that. The darkly in his mirror is because those ancient mirrors are technically not that crisp, whereas what we think of as a mirror now, these large rolled glass silver backed stuff, that's a high tech of the 17th century.
Well, that changes my reading of the evil mother staring at the mirror. It's kind of meta. It's like modernity trying to stare at fairy stories for meaning.
Ooh,
and then
yes,
not having the clarity. Yeah. Isn't it? So Germany's staring at this shit mirror because it's completely detached itself from Christic reality through all of these side quests and fan fiction insanities. Staring, and never seeing anything.
But it's a modern image.
Yes, but it's still not clear if you're not referencing the Gothic and the medieval, and you're only referencing the utility of the office building that's been constructed in its place. That's the glass darkly, the fairy story.
The fairy story itself is the glass darkly.
Yeah.
Obsessive
fixation on it because you know that there is something there that should be there, but you can't see it.
So the Grimms actually did know what they were doing, and here's an image from their first edition, or a Sneewittchen, and here she is in her glass coffin with the inscription. There's one dwarf sitting next to her, and there are 3 birds, which are the birds that Murphy used to title his book: the owl, the raven, and the dove. And they watch over Snow White when she's in her glass casket. And who comes to
In the coffin.
stand and watch and see if this very open appeal of a glass casket on a mountain is answered? The answer, I think, is one of Wilhelm Grimm's finest, and in it he reveals in slightly veiled form the heart of the magic of his fairy tales. And the animals came too and cried over Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, last a little dove. Und die Tiere kamen auch und beweinten Schneewittchen, erst eine Eule, dann ein Rabe, zuletzt ein Taubchen. Nature, which always recognized her as one of her own, now cries over her loss. Only those who did not love do not mourn. Cinderella knew that, even pets and animals know that. But of all the animals of the forest, Disney will have many more. Why these three? For millennia, the three religions have accompanied the good human being with hope for rescue for as far as they can go up to the grave. The classical, the Germanic, and the Christian religions can now only mourn, keep watch over the body as they always have done, and hope. Where do these spirits of hope come from? Where in the forest is their real place of origin? Their colors tell much. The owl is reddish brown, red. The raven is black. The dove is white. They are the colors of Snow White's soul, her person itself, and it is from the soul of the good person that religion's spirit originates, from its red loving warmth, from its white loyal innocence, from its humbling black and earth-like mortality. The three birds are the soul of mankind, keeping watch over the body to see if it can come to life again, to see if there is a resurrection of the body and life everlasting, to see if death is asleep. And they keep their long vigil over her. As they keep their long vigil over her, the owl dreams of her rescue by some provident accident. The raven dreams of her rescue by a tree. And the dove dreams that one day the king's son will come for her.
That's so sad.
Oh no, it's beautiful. It's not sad at all, because the king's son does come. And finds her in a glass coffin and welcomes her back into life. Now, what's funny is I never got this reading just the Grimm version. My German is not what it should be, given how much I wanted it. But I have read Goethe's version in German, and for some reason it leapt out at me, and that she's obviously in a reliquary. She's obviously asleep, waiting for the resurrection. And what Murphy can see, and here's Bavaria is full of these saints, right? And I was sort of picking which one I'm going to show you, right? The jeweled saints of Bavaria, the catacomb saints and stuff. A glass coffin is clearly a reliquary. In Grimm, they put it on a mountain, right? But in normal life, here's Bernadette at Lourdes. They are in churches. And that Snow White is surrounded by the owl, the raven, and the dove, the classical, the Germanic, and the Christian. I mean, you see that Murphy was very practiced in being able to see these kinds of things between the raven at the baptism and the dove, right? He sees this is different from just saying all stories teach the same thing, because they don't. It's showing that the truth to which they point is in this fairy story world actually the truth, which is the truth of the resurrection. So that the king's son comes, and when he looks in the glass casket and sees her, he realizes why he came into the woods. He cannot live without her. Faith, hope, and love write the ending. The prince is surely the Christ figure of Wilhelm's many readings in the New Testament on the resurrection. Christ is the friend of the Germanic religious dwarfs, and he sees the beauty of the dead Snow White. Wilhelm seems almost to be thinking of St. Paul's famous equation of death with sleep, as the prince asks if he can take her with him. And Murphy quotes from Thessalonians. And then they try to carry the casket away, and they trip on a tree branch, so the raven is satisfied. It seems to be an accident, so the owl is satisfied. But the dove understands that it's the prince who came and raised her back to life. And Trina Schardt-Hyman, to her enormous credit in her representation, gets that this is a Christian story, because in her opening scene, I had her the earlier picture with the queen looking at the 3 drops of blood, which Murphy also points out is from Parsifal, right? Parsifal is stunned into sort of meditation on his love by 3 drops of blood on the snow. Wilhelm Grimm is very, very educated in stories, and he's putting them all into his story, which is exactly what we're doing with ours, and doing it on purpose to pull out all of those resonances that are constantly there. But it's not just of, oh, the numbers of times that we've told the story about a woman who's jealous of her daughter, right? It's this beautiful representation of the hope of our faith. And I'm showing now the facing page of the picture in Trina Schardheiman's picture, where the mother's looking out of the window into the snow. In fact, what she's also looking at is a representation of Our Lady and her son in a triptych, right? And that kind of image, this religious image, is of course what the Reformation destroyed, but which is there at the heart of all of these stories. It's the image that is the reality of our hope and our joy. And that Grimm put this into the stories, and nobody sees it now. They just go with Bettelheim and say it's Freudian. Is a destruction up there with the destruction of Germany's medieval treasures by other means. And so that's why we can't see that what Snow White actually is the Ark. And Mary, I mean, that she's sleeping, waiting the resurrection, but we have her in this things that show up across Mary, the Ark of the Covenant, right? Catholics also view Mary as the New Testament Ark of the Covenant. The Old Testament Ark of the Covenant contained 3 items: the Word of God, the manna from heaven, and the rod of Aaron. But she's shown here. It's like Raiders of the Lost Ark. I did it. I promised that boomerang would come back.
She's done it.
Of course it's the Ark, right? It's like you're always in this story, because it's always going to come back to the revelation of God's entering into our story, and the artist that works with us and makes with us and is in joy with us, and fights the dragon for us, right? Here's the Lord fighting the Leviathan. And therefore, and this is of Hildegard's imagery, that great fairy story that we're in of the dragon slayer is that of creation and redemption through the incarnation.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking as you're describing this, the like that kind of iconoclasm of the story, forgetting what the glass case is, forgetting that it's the Ark. The Reformation set the wheels in motion for this kind of amnesia of European people, to forget the Ark entirely. Mary as Ark, Saint Mary, the Virgin as the Ark of God. So it's kind of mind-blowing that really, as you're describing this, I'm thinking this is Christendom broken, Christendom with a broken heart, trying to replace her role in European reality. It's an irreplaceable, missing it's not even a totem. It's the guiding piece of all our mythology. The reality of the story that we're in is that Ark that's been
Blasted by dragons, as indeed Notre Dame was in 2019. Still more believable than the official story that it was blasted by dragons. It's Notre Dame. It's the
Yeah.
Ark.
Yeah.
It's like and everybody. What was interesting in 2019 when the cathedral caught fire, and the refusal of people, even within the church, to say the reason this building mattered was because it was dedicated to Our Lady. I did a few pieces on this, saying, why weren't anybody talking about this? It's like Our Lady is the Ark. This Notre Dame is the place of praise for her, and people were talking about it, the sort of material beauty of the thing, right? It's like, oh, we need it, it belongs to the world. It's like, yes, because it's Our Lady, the Ark, and we are incapable of seeing what that means, and so we get nothing but these, like, I like that image that you have of the actual cathedral's been placed with an office block or something, so that we can't see Snow White in the casket as an image of the Dormition and the hope for resurrection, the king's son. I mean, think about the king. What is it that happens when Mary rises again after her falling asleep? The Dormition in the Orthodox tradition. Oh, right, the king's son comes and takes her to heaven with him. Gee, that must be a little hard to figure out. But it is, if you don't know those stories, the actual true Christian layering of stories. And what we're we've said this many times, we hope that that's what we're going to be able to do with Draco Chemicus, is retell this great story of dragon slaying in a way in which the full resonances of its significance capture people's attention, because we do actually have to keep retelling the stories, because otherwise people don't see how they're in them. But the whole point is always to be seeing, you're in this story. This is our story. And this, of course, to catch that boomerang, is in fact what Tolkien said fairy stories were. The particular joy in the successful fantasy can thus be explained as the sudden glimpse of the underlying reality or truth. And what is that reality or truth, Professor Tolkien? I would venture to say that approaching the Christian story from this direction, it has long been my feeling, a joyous feeling, that God redeemed the corrupt making creatures, men, in a way fitting to this aspect as to others of their strange nature. The Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind, which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. They contain many marvels, peculiarly artistic, beautiful, and moving, mythical in their perfect self-contained significance, and among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe. But this story has entered history and the primary world. The desire and aspiration of subcreation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. It has preeminently the inner consistency of reality. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. For the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. To reject it leads either to sadness or to wrath. I mean, it's interesting that Tater, in her excerpting of what did Tolkien say about storytellers, you can completely miss the fact that what Tolkien said was the gospel is the story, is the fairy story. That's it. We are in it. This one, the fairy story, the fairy story, the fairy story. And he goes on at that same passage to say, sorry, it's the joy, it's the blah, 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 blah. This story is supreme and it is true. Art has been verified. God is the Lord of angels and of men and of elves. Legend and history have met and fused. It's the gospel is the fairy story, and all. I mean, Grimm. What's interesting is, like, Grimm is doing that too. The Grimms are rewriting the stories that they have to fit within the frame of the story. And so if we find them and respond to them now, all of these stories that the Grimms purposefully rewrote to make more beautiful, they're making them more beautiful in a particular frame.
Yeah, they're casting their gems and their jewels in a particular a particular kind of wax impression
to make a very beautiful reliquary from which we will rise again.
It's magnificent. You've left me speechless.
Caught that boomerang.
You got it.
And I mean, it's to think. I mean, what's funny is we say, are we sad that people can't see this in the stories? That you know they're wanting them to be sort of floating out there in an ether of a soup of stories that the sort of quintessential human truths of sexual dynamics, which are true, which we should deal with in stories, but not recognizing that the reason, I mean, so I say, why do these stories have such power over this? Well, possibly because they participate in the story that's true.
Yes.
This is why Tolkien stories do. The Lord of the Rings does, because it's Christian too.
Yeah. It doesn't resonate unless it's anchored in the truth.
Right. And what's wonderful, so in our story we have the dragon looking at himself in the crystal, right? Which is like, you realize all of this mirroring problem is constant, right? Are you able to look at Christ, or are you looking at yourself in some kind of reflection? The idolatry is constantly. So Snow White, the stepmother's mirror is obviously idolatrous of herself, but that is what Satan does, right? He's always wanting to look at himself, talk about himself, be proud of himself. That's the point, pride, right? And in medieval representations of like vanity and such, you'll be holding a mirror, and it's like you're always looking more at yourself than at Christ.
It's modernity.
That's modernity.
It's a hole of mirrors.
Which brings us very nicely back to how Granny Weatherwax solves it, right? That she's trapped in the mirrors that Lily has made, and she's able to know who she is. Now, Pratchett is not writing as a Christian, so there's, you can have those layers there, but the knowledge of the reality of the truth, so that you're not caught in these mirror reflections, is also obviously one of the things we've been working with in the arc, right? It's like you're on the surface of all of these stories, but you're in the arc. We're hoping to be able to, see ourselves clearly, who we are.
Yeah, and have a reconnection with the threads, all of the threads that went into the fairy story that we're living. Not ignoring any of them anymore.
Make fairy stories gospel again.
Yep.
So we hope now it makes a little more sense, although it's like it's a long throw on the boomerang on this episode, but it matters a lot. These stories matter immensely because they carry our heart.
Yes.
Whew. Okay, shall we let them go now? Okay.
Yes.
Please.
They need to contemplate the glass coffin.
They do. They do. And they need to check out our website at dragoncommonroom.com. And if they watch this before the morning of June 20th, June 19th is the last full day, please join us in the arc and on the stream and in the story. It's a happy one. It has a happy ending. We promise. Okay. We'll let you go now. Good night. Bye.